Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. Today I'm going to show you how to make some fruit syrups to flavor your kombucha or to make cocktails with. I really love making fruit flavored simple syrups. I think they're fantastic just to have on hand if you need some simple syrups to make homemade cocktails with, but they're also fantastic for flavoring kombucha. And I love them for a couple of different reasons. One, because it actually is a good way to use the rind and the peel of a lot of different citrus fruits that we otherwise would just discard, and because they taste fantastic. I'm gonna go ahead and show you how I like to make citrus syrup, simple syrups, using just like the discardable peels and piths of different citrus fruits. So here I have some blood oranges, some limes, some lemons, and some kind of clementine tangerine citrus fruits. And I had previously juiced these so that I could use the juice to flavor homemade kombucha. And obviously, freshly juiced citrus is fantastic for flavoring homemade kombucha. I love using freshly juiced citrus in that capacity, but oftentimes after you're done juicing your citrus, you're left with these peels that most people would just compost or discard, but there's actually a lot of really fantastic volatile essential oils that live on the zest of the fruit. And so why not, make the most out of the fruit that we already have on hand and just turn it into something that we can use in other purposes. So today I'm going to show you how I like to make syrups out of these citrus fruits. So here we've got about 5 or so different tangerines that I've already previously juiced. I'm just going to roughly chop them and throw them into a small saucepan. And you can do this with really any citrus fruit. I actually also really love doing this with pineapple cores. So the kind of really tough, fibrous core at the center of a fresh pineapple is not great for eating, but it's great for making syrups with, because there is still a good amount of pineapple flavor in that core, but it's just not really palatable to us because it is very fibrous. So I'm gonna add about a cup of sugar here and about a cup of water. I'm just gonna turn my flame on. So I'm gonna just go ahead and stir that around. And what I'm doing here is essentially infusing the liquid and the sugar with the flavors that are locked into these orange peels and the pulpy part of the tangerine. And don't be afraid to go ahead and just muddle it around in the pan to really get as much of any remaining juice out of the citrus, but also to help push those essential oils that live in the zest of the fruit and get that to go into the simple syrup. So I really love, like I mentioned, I love using this to flavor kombucha. It is different from using straight up tangerine juice to flavor your kombucha. It's a much more mellow flavor. So if you're really looking for something that's intensely citrusy, definitely use the juice or use the syrup in conjunction with the juice. But I find that this provides a very mellow, lightly citrus flavor to the brew that is delicious in its own. And it also just saves on waste because it gives a second life to these tangerine peels. I'm not actually sure whether these are mandarins, tangerines, or clementines. I always forget how they're categorized, but they are delicious nonetheless. So I would just let this simmer and steep for at least 10 minutes or so. I'm using super high heat. If you really wanted to extract as much flavor out of this as you could, I would recommend going on a low heat and letting it simmer for a good long while, and that'll extract a lot of flavor from these peels. It really is just dependent on how much time you're willing to dedicate to the process. It's a very flexible recipe. This is just a starting point. I didn't even really measure how many little tangerines I threw in here. It's just however many I happen to have on hand. And you can obviously scale this up or scale this down depending on how much fruit you have. What's great about this is you can also add a lot of different spices to it. I have a whole other video dedicated to using herbs and spices to make syrups for flavoring kombucha, so definitely check that out if you're curious about that in more detail. But I also love making spiced fruit syrups, and tangerines and oranges in particular are fantastic with spices like cinnamon or clove or star anise, especially in the fall and the winter time. It makes for a very delicious kind of seasonal homebrew. So this is already coming up to a simmer, so I'm just gonna let this simmer for a few more minutes before I strain the liquid. But again, this makes for a very lovely flavored citrus syrup. And I like to use a couple of teaspoons or so of this per 16-ounce bottle of kombucha, maybe a tablespoon. It really depends on the strength of the syrup. It depends on what else you're adding into the brew. With kombucha brewing, a lot of it is so subjective to how ripe the fruit is, how potent the flavors are, your palate, what types of flavors and flavor profiles you prefer. And so rather than go off of any specific measurements or recipes, I always just to encourage people to go by taste. Just taste the brew. If it tastes like it could use a little bit more flavor, add more. If you've added too much, then you can adjust the next time just to make sure that you're making the brew taste the way you want it to taste. And the good thing about kombucha brewing is that it is very adaptable. So you can really just kind of eyeball things and you can just adjust as you go to really tailor the flavors to what you want it to taste like. So this is coming up on a real nice rolling boil. I'm just gonna go ahead and give it a taste now. I'm gonna turn this heat off. It smells wonderful. It's got a real marmalade kind of vibe to it. It's not super acidic because again, we did juice a lot of the juice out of these tangerines, but it's a very mild, mellow, lightly citrus flavor that is fantastic for cocktails as well. So I love using these in place of regular simple syrup for cocktails. So there is our tangerine syrup. Now for these next couple of batches of syrup, I'm gonna follow the exact same process. So just chop the citrus up, add it with a cup of sugar and water and let that simmer. And I will say too that you don't have to use plain white cane sugar. I just happen to have that on hand, but for this phase you can use honey, you can use agave, you can use coconut sugar. What's great about these syrups is that you'll be using them during the second fermentation phase. And I mentioned this in a few of my other videos as well, but whenever you're using flavorings, whether they're fruit flavorings or herbs, you always want to use them during the second fermentation phase. That's basically when you are flavoring your kombucha and carbonating it. You don't need to add these flavorings during the first fermentation phase because that could actually hinder the health of your SCOBY or your culture in the long term. But flavorings are totally fine to use during second fermentation because all you're gonna do is drink the kombucha at that point. You're not using that flavored kombucha to make any future batches of kombucha. So that's why it's totally okay to use flavorings during the second fermentation phase. But we're just gonna go ahead and make a couple of batches of citrus syrup here with the lemons and limes and with the blood oranges. So as you can see, it's really easy to make really delicious citrus syrups using the peels that we otherwise would have just likely discarded. And so now you can get a little bit of extra life out of those citrus fruits in addition to using the juice from them. Now, you can definitely make fruit syrups with all sorts of different types of fruits. And so for my next example, I'm just gonna use frozen strawberries. You could, of course, use fresh strawberries, fresh berries, really any kind of fruit that you want, you can turn into a syrup. I like to just have frozen berries on hand just because it's great for just making a quick fruit compote or a fruit jam, and also for making fruit syrup. So for today, I'm gonna show you how to make a strawberry brown sugar syrup. So just gonna add about, I wanna say maybe a half a cup to a cup of strawberries. These are straight from the freezer, no need to defrost them or anything. And again, you can use fresh if you have that available as well. And for this one, I'm going to use a cup of brown sugar. So like I mentioned, you can really use any sweetener you like here. So about a cup of lightly packed brown sugar right there, and a cup of water. And just stir that around. So I add water here because I do want this to be more of a syrupy, liquidy consistency. But again, if you do want this to be just a thicker fruit pureed consistency, you can adjust the thickness level just based on how much liquid you want to add here. I love mixing berries and brown sugar. I find that the kind of molassesy warmth and depth of the brown sugar works really well with the bright berry flavor. I love doing this with raspberries. I love doing this with blackberries. So you can really let your imagination go wild here with all the different fruit and flavor combination. And as the strawberries soften, you can just use your spoon to crush them up to release more of those juices. Since I was using frozen, I didn't bother to chop them up, but if you defrosted them in advance, or if you're using fresh berries, go ahead and give them a rough chop just to make it a little bit easier for the liquid to extract all that strawberry flavor out of the fruit. But since I was going from frozen, I just didn't bother. Figured I would just muddle it in the pan. Either way works. As the strawberries boil, they will soften and it will get easier to just smush them up against the side of the pan. Like I was doing with the citrus peels earlier on, you can just use the flat part of the spoon to push them up against the side of the pot. And that'll essentially do the same thing. If you find that your spoon isn't doing as good of a job with kind of smushing the strawberries up, you could also just use a fork, and that'll definitely just crush them up. And I only added about a half cup, 3/4 of a cup of frozen strawberries here because that's just all I happen to have on hand. But if you want more intense strawberry flavor, you can absolutely adjust the amount of fruit that you use, or just use less water and less sugar. And that'll achieve the same type of flavor concentration. It is always just dependent on the strawberries that you get, whether they're in season, how sweet they are. Frozen fruit is generally picked at peak ripeness and frozen right away, so that's always a good bet rather than buying fruit that's out of season that likely won't have the same level of flavor that you want from fruit that's in season. But again, just use whatever you have on hand that's available. Just stir it around. And you can really smell those strawberries now that this has really come to a real rolling boil here. It smells delicious and it's really fantastic with the brown sugar. And I love mixing berries and herbs. Strawberries do particularly well with thyme. I love mixing raspberries and rosemary. Lots of fantastic flavor combinations. And I actually have a sprig of rosemary on hand here that I'm actually just gonna throw right into the mix just because we have it. Why not? Let that rosemary infuse. And again, no specific maximum or minimum time here. Just make sure that the liquid isn't boiling away or evaporating. Just make sure you're keeping an eye on it and stirring it consistently. So you can really just eyeball it until the fruit really starts disintegrating and no longer really looks like what it used to. That's when you know that a lot of that flavor and the sugars and the strawberries are seeping out of the fruit and into the syrup, which is exactly what you want. So just let that continue to simmer. And if you're curious about how to use herbs when flavoring kombucha, I have a whole other video on that. So definitely give that a watch if you're curious about using herbs to flavor kombucha. Just gonna give this a taste. Nice, and you can get just the faintest hint of that rosemary too. I think this is at a pretty good spot. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn my flame off. It smells really good. Grab a bottle. And I like straining the strawberries out only because I like to use these syrups for both flavoring kombucha and for making cocktails with. And so I just prefer my fruit syrups to have a very smooth consistency. But if you want to, you absolutely could use this remaining strawberry pulp. This is actually really delicious if you have like a piece of toast. Just use that as jam, spread it on a piece of toast, make yourself a PB&J. That doesn't have to go to waste at all. I really love how just beautiful these strained syrups look. So depending on how strong the syrup is and how strong you like that fruit flavor to come through in your kombucha, I'd recommend maybe using about a tablespoon of the syrup per 16-ounce bottle. You can obviously adjust. And again, these are going to be lighter in fruit flavor than using the straight up fruit juice or fruit puree from fresh fruit. So you might need to do a little bit of just experimenting to see what flavor profile you like. But I really love this for just a very mellow fruit sweetness to my kombucha, and like I mentioned, I love using them as simple syrups in cocktails or mocktails. What I also like about this is if you're planning on using these syrups without any additional fruit purees or fruit juices, the fact that there is sugar in these syrups will actually help that fermentation process continue during second fermentation. So again, yeasts and bacteria that live in your SCOBY or your symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast feed on the sugar to produce the carbon dioxide. So if you want your kombucha to be fizzy, that sugar is a great tool and a great asset to help the yeast do that for you. So the sugar serves the purpose of one, flavoring and giving your kombucha a nice level of sweetness, but also serves to feed the yeasts that are in your brew to produce that CO2. So I hope this was helpful in giving you some inspiration for ways that you could use lemon peels and orange peels that you might have otherwise discarded, and to find other ways to flavor your kombucha using syrups. If you're curious about how I use herbs and flowers and spices to flavor my kombucha, definitely check that video out. And if you're curious about other kombucha brewing related topics, you can find a whole host of other videos and topics on my channel or at youbrewkombucha.com. Happy brewing!